Good morning, everyone. I am Mark Federico, and I'm here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Foster and his research that he did independently after he graduated the DHSC program. Obviously, the title was Retrospective Glucose Control and Cardiac Rehabilitation. Brian reached out to me a while ago and asked if he could present this to the department, and I open-armed and said, absolutely, anything you need from me, we will go ahead and do it. So this is the culmination of his research that he did. I'm going to let Brian talk about how the research started and go through his entire presentation. We will open it up for questions at the end if anybody does have any questions. I know I do. But I would like to thank everybody in attendance here. And Brian, whenever you're ready, please feel free to start.
Sure. And thank you, Dr. Federico. So I'd like to welcome you to this morning's presentation, Retrospective Glucose Control in Cardiac Rehabilitation. So this presentation is based on a dissertation I actually began during my doctoral program and then completed after graduation. While a dissertation wasn't required for my program, I chose to pursue it, for one, to advance my research skills, and because my professional interests really rely on teaching at the college level. While earning my doctoral degree, I worked for Penn Medicine, which is a health system affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I was part of Chester County Hospital's Phase 2 cardiac rehabilitation program, where I primarily worked with individuals with diabetes. Now, cardiac rehabilitation and its complementary program, pulmonary rehabilitation, is the only structured exercise program for chronic disease that's covered by insurance. And as a clinical exercise physiologist, for me, that's a fascinating topic. This experience allowed me to become certified as a diabetes care and education specialist and also inspired the focus of my dissertation. Diabetes has always been and will always be a primary interest of mine, as both my son and I have type 1 diabetes, each of us being diagnosed at an early age. With that context in mind, we can turn our attention to the topics we'll be covering for today. I'll start with background and rationale, then move into methods, results, and finally discuss implications and future directions. So cardiac rehabilitation, or as I'm going to say throughout the presentation, cardiac rehab, is a well-established for improving cardiovascular outcomes following a cardiac event, particularly in populations at a high metabolic risk. What remains less clear is whether those benefits extend to glycemic control. Much of the existing literature in this area compares patients with diabetes to those without, or when looking at those with diabetes, putting the focus just on cardiac-related outcomes as opposed to metabolic ones. So to explore that, this study looked at changes not only in glucose, but also broader cardiometabolic outcomes among participants completing the program. So the central question guiding this work was whether taking part in cardiac rehab was associated with measurable changes in cardiometabolic outcomes. In particular, I looked at changes in blood glucose, blood pressure, lipid profiles, and weight over the course of the program. Diabetes and cardiovascular disease are closely interconnected, sharing many of the same underlying features. Cardiac rehab targets several of these factors through its structured exercise, education, and behavioral support. Because of that, it provides a useful setting for examining broader changes beyond traditional cardiac outcomes. That connection can be better understood through the theoretical framework guiding this study. Two complementary perspectives help explain this relationship. Physiological theories of exercise and metabolic health suggest that regular physical activity improves key metabolic processes, including insulin sensitivity, lipid metabolism, blood pressure regulation, and weight management. These mechanisms provide a biological explanation for why engagement in cardiac rehab may influence glycemic control. While the biopsychosocial model emphasizes that health outcomes result from not only physiological processes, but from interactions among biological, psychological, and social factors. Cardiac rehab reflects this model perfectly by combining its components of exercise training, education, behavioral counseling, and social support. Together, these frameworks support the expectation that cardiac rehab could produce improvements in cardiometabolic outcomes among individuals with diabetes, and helps to directly represent the conceptual framework. So participation in cardiac rehab served as the independent variable, and as mentioned in the previous slide, includes structured exercise, education, and behavioral support. The features of cardiac rehab helps establish beneficial behavioral changes, such as increased physical activity, improved nutrition, as well as psychological improvements, including reduced stress and enhanced well-being. These mediating factors were expected to influence the cardiometabolic outcomes, blood glucose, blood pressure, lipid profiles, and weight-related indicators, which served as the dependent variable. This framework guided both my outcome selection and interpretation of findings. Now, diabetes and cardiovascular disease has a well-established two-way relationship. They share a lot of the same metabolic risk factors, including physical inactivity, dyslipidemia, hypertension, and excess weight. Managing both conditions relies heavily on long-term lifestyle changes, typically supported through structured education and behavioral support. Cardiac rehabilitation is one example of this type of intervention and is unique in that it also includes exercise training to improve cardiovascular outcomes. Because these closely overlap with diabetes management strategies, cardiac rehab may also impact metabolic outcomes that are important for diabetes care. Now, despite this overlap, much of the existing literature has focused primarily on cardiovascular outcomes. And as a result, less attention has been given to understanding metabolic changes occurring within individuals with diabetes who complete cardiac rehab. This study addresses that gap by examining within-group changes using a pre-test, post-test approach and focusing specifically on glycemic and broader cardiometabolic outcomes. That gap directly informed the design choices used in this study. So to address that gap, a retrospective pre-test, post-test design was used. This approach allowed for the examination of changes within participants over time using real-world clinical data. Engaging in cardiac rehabilitation served as the independent variable, while cardiometabolic outcomes, blood glucose, blood pressure, lipids, and weight, were evaluated as the dependent variables. Although pre-experimental designs have known limitations related to internal and external validity, the design was appropriate for exploratory evaluation within an applied cardiac setting where randomized assignment was not feasible. A quantitative approach was used to evaluate measurable changes in these health outcomes. The retrospective design involved analysis of clinical data collected over a 5-year period from 2018 through 2022. This timeframe allowed for inclusion of a large clinical sample reflective of real-world practice. The broader population relevant to this study includes individuals eligible for cardiac rehabilitation following cardiovascular events. Now, despite established benefits, participation rates remain relatively low, with approximately 1/4 of eligible individuals enrolling in cardiac rehabilitation programs nationally. Among those who do participate, a substantial proportion, somewhere between 26 to 54%, have diabetes. Individuals with diabetes represent a particularly important subgroup because they often demonstrate lower participation and completion rates while simultaneously carrying a higher cardiometabolic risk burden. For these reasons, examining outcomes within this population provides clinically meaningful insight into the potential benefits of cardiac rehabilitation. So a convenience sampling approach was used, drawing from individuals who had completed cardiac rehab program and had available clinical data. Because the study was retrospective, selection was based on existing records rather than active recruitment. Participants were required to have a diagnosis of diabetes, complete cardiac rehab between 2018 and 2022, and have both pre-test and post-test data available for the outcomes of interest. Individuals with stress-related diabetes diagnosis, as well as those missing corresponding pre-test or post-test data, were excluded from my analysis. Now, because the study was retrospective, there was no active recruitment process. Data was obtained from existing clinical records associated with the cardiac rehabilitation program, as well as electronic health records from Penn Medicine. The University of Pennsylvania's Institutional Review Board determined that the informed consent was not required for this study design, as the research involved retrospective analysis of de-identified data. This is consistent with standard practice for retrospective EHR-based research. Now, outcomes were selected to reflect clinically relevant indicators of glycemic control and cardiometabolic health, commonly monitored in both diabetes and cardiac rehab settings. Glycemic control served as the primary outcome and was evaluated using hemoglobin A1C and estimated average glucose. Secondary outcomes included blood pressure measures, a comprehensive lipid profile, and weight-related indicators such as body weight and BMI. This combination provides a multidimensional assessment of metabolic and cardiovascular health changes associated with cardiac rehab participation. So data for this study were obtained from two primary sources: cardiac rehab program records and participants' electronic health records. Information was manually extracted by the researcher to ensure consistency in identifying variables and then aligning them with the study criteria. The extracted data were then organized within a structured Excel database designed to track outcome measures and corresponding time points. Following collection, identifying information was removed and all data was stored on a secure, password-protected institutional server. Because this study relied on retrospective clinical data, several challenges were related to the timing of outcome measurements. The challenge was that not all the data was collected at the same time. Blood pressure and weight are outcomes that were actually taken at the start and finish of each exercise session in cardiac rehab, and they're easily recorded at the beginning and the ending of the program. Now, blood glucose and lipid value measurements are very different, not only in their invasiveness, but in their method of analysis. These types of measurements are influenced both by clinical decision-making and insurance coverage, and as a result, were not consistently aligned with the start and completion of cardiac rehab. These factors require the development of a structured and consistent approach to define appropriate pretest and post-test time points for analysis. So solution number one, to address these timing challenges, standardized windows were developed to define pretest and post-test measurements relative to each participation's time in rehabilitation. These parameters were applied consistently using an Excel-based formula. Pretest values were identified within a window extending up to 90 days prior to program initiation and shortly after it began. Post-test values were identified within an opposite yet similar window, beginning shortly before the completion of the program to 90 days afterward. This example illustrates how windows were applied for an individual assessment or an individual participant. And based on the start and end dates of the program, the defined windows were used to identify the most appropriate pretest and post-test measurements. This approach ensured consistency while allowing flexibility within real-world clinical data. Solution number two. Because clinical testing varied across participants, not all individuals had complete data for every single outcome measure. And rather than excluding participants entirely, each outcome was analyzed independently using the available data for that variable. And this approach allowed for inclusion of the largest possible sample of each outcome while maintaining transparency in the analysis. Statistical analysis were conducted using SPSS version 29. Descriptive statistics included means and standard deviations were calculated to summarize the outcome measures. To evaluate changes over time, paired t-tests were used to compare pretest and post-test values for each variable. Effect sizes were calculated using Cohen's d to assess the magnitude of those changes. To support the robustness of the findings, results were confirmed using the non-parametric equivalent of the paired t-test, the Wilcoxon sign rank test. While the analysis provides insight into these outcomes, several limitations should be considered when interpreting these findings. First, the retrospective one-group pretest post-test design limits the ability to establish causation, as changes cannot be attributed solely to the involvement of cardiac rehab. In addition, the use of convenience sample may limit generalizability to broader populations. Finally, reliance on existing clinical data introduces variability both in measurement timing and completeness. Despite these limitations, the study reflects real-world clinical practice, which supports its relevance to applied healthcare settings. As previously mentioned, this study was reviewed by the Institutional Review Board from the University of Pennsylvania and determined to be exempt due to its retrospective design and lack of direct patient interaction or intervention. Participant confidentiality was protected through the removal of identifying information following data collection. All data were stored in a secure, password-protected institutional server with access restricted only to the researcher. These procedures ensured protection of participant privacy and maintained data integrity throughout the study. Out of all individuals entering cardiac rehabilitation between 2018 to 2022, about 36% had diabetes, which highlights just how common diabetes is in this population. When we look more closely at their clinical profile, these participants carried a significant cardiometabolic burden. Rates of hypertension, dyslipidemia were both over 80%, while just over half met the criteria for obesity. So this is a group with multiple overlapping risk factors. Demographically, the sample was older, with an average age of about 68, and predominantly male and white. Additionally, about two-thirds were classified as high risk for a subsequent cardiovascular event, which is consistent with what we see typically in the cardiac rehab populations. Finally, of the 789 individuals with diabetes who entered the program, 397 completed cardiac rehabilitation and were included in at least one of the analyses. So overall, this reflects a high-risk, clinically complex population, which makes it particularly relevant when we think about the potential impact of cardiac rehab on both cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes. Turning to the primary outcome, we observed improvements in glycemic control over the course of the program. Hemoglobin A1C decreased from 7.12 to 6.77, indicating improved long-term glucose control. A similar pattern was observed in estimated average glucose, which declined from 157 to 148 milligrams per deciliter. These changes are statistically significant, with effect sizes in the small to moderate range, suggesting that participation in cardiac rehab was associated with meaningful improvement in glycemic outcomes. The non-parametric sensitivity analysis were also conducted and yielding consistent results, supporting the robustness of these findings. In addition to glycemic outcomes, we also observed improvements across several cardiometabolic risk factors. Paired comparisons demonstrated pre-test, post-test improvements in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, as well as multiple components of the lipid profile, including reductions in total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, along with an increase in HDL cholesterol. These findings were statistically significant, with effect sizes in the small to moderate range. Overall, these changes are consistent with the expected physiological benefits of structured exercise and participation in cardiac rehab. Non-parametric sensitivity analysis yielded similar results, supporting the findings. The only lipid outcome that did not reach significance was VLDL, although the Wilcoxon-signed rank test indicated a significant change. As VLDL had the smallest sample size, it's possible that the analysis was just underpowered to detect a significant change. Weight and BMI also did not reach statistical significance, and given their large sample sizes, it likely reflects true non-significant findings rather than a lack of power. In addition to changes in mean values, we also examined the proportion of participants achieving guideline-directed targets at the program completion. High rates of target attainment were obtained across several domains. Approximately 91% of patients achieved target levels for hemoglobin A1C and estimated average glucose. Blood pressure control was also strong, with 86% achieving systolic targets and 97% achieving diastolic targets. Lipid outcomes were particularly notable, with nearly all participants reaching for total cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, and approximately 69% achieving LDL cholesterol goals. In contrast, fewer participants achieved targets for weight and BMI, and changes in these measures were small. This suggests that while cardiometabolic markers improved, Weight-related outcomes may be less responsive over the time frame of cardiac rehab. Overall, these findings reinforce the clinical impact of cardiac rehab across multiple risk factors, while also illustrating areas where additional interventions may be needed. These findings have several practice limitations for clinical care. First, cardiac rehab may support improvements in glycemic outcomes among individuals with diabetes, suggesting benefits beyond traditional cardiovascular endpoints. Exercise professionals may play an important role in reducing cardiometabolic risk, particularly through structured supervised interventions. In addition, integrating glucose monitoring into exercise settings may enhance both safety and individualized care. These findings highlight opportunities for stronger collaboration between cardiac rehab professionals and diabetes care teams. And finally, because we can learn just as much from our non-significant results to support successful weight management, existing tools and resources should be evaluated and strengthened. While these findings have important clinical limitations, or have important clinical implications, several limitations should be considered when interpreting these results. The study design limits the ability to draw causal conclusions, as changes cannot be attributed solely to participation in cardiac rehab. In addition, the use of a limited sample may limit generalizability to other populations and settings. Variability in clinical data collection may also influence the precision of outcome measurements. But despite these considerations, the study reflects real-world clinical practice, which supports its relevance to applied healthcare settings. Now, future research should build on the findings by further clarifying the relationship between cardiac rehab and glycemic outcomes in those with diabetes. Prospective studies that include control or comparison groups could strengthen causal inference and help isolate the specific contribution of cardiac rehabilitation participation. Expanding research to larger and more diverse populations would also improve the generalizability and allow for examination of subgroup differences, such as diabetes type, age, and comorbid conditions. In addition, long-term follow-up studies are also needed to determine whether improvements observed during cardiac rehabilitation are sustained after program completion. Other avenues of research could include integration of diabetes technologies, such as continuous glucose monitoring, within exercise-based programs to better understand glucose responses to structured physical activity. We should also evaluate new approaches toward weight management in the cardiac rehabilitation model. Should be evaluated through Finally, interdisciplinary care models that intentionally integrate cardiac rehab with diabetes education and clinical care may represent an important direction for improving future cardiometabolic outcomes and warrant further investigation. And if I could add one more comment with this section, the outcomes included in this dissertation represent just a subset of the broader data collection collected by the cardiac rehab program, which also included functional, behavioral, and psychosocial measures. The analysis presented here have been submitted to the American Diabetes Association's Diabetes, Obesity, and Cardiometabolic Care Journal. If accepted, a second set of analysis would be conducted for future publication. This study examined the relationship between cardiac rehab participation and glycemic outcomes among individuals with diabetes. The findings suggest that participation in cardiac rehab was associated with improvements in glycemic measures, supporting the idea that structured exercise programs may provide both cardiovascular and metabolic benefits. These results highlight cardiac rehab as an under-recognized environment for supporting diabetes management. While traditionally focused on cardiovascular recovery, cardiac rehab programs may also serve as valuable settings for improving broader cardiometabolic health. The study further supports the importance of integrated care approaches that address cardiovascular disease and diabetes together rather than independently. Standard cardiac rehabilitation alone may not be enough to support weight loss, and that additional or more targeted weight management strategies may be needed. Although additional research is needed to establish causality and expand generalizability, these findings contribute to growing evidence supporting exercise-based interventions as important components of diabetes care. My final recommendations. First, cardiac rehab should be considered as a component of comprehensive diabetes management, particularly for individuals with coexisting cardiovascular disease. Second, a stronger collaboration between cardiac rehab professionals and diabetes care specialists may enhance patient outcomes by aligning exercise programming with diabetes self-management education. Third, incorporating glucose monitoring education into exercise-based programs may improve participant safety and empower individuals to better understand their physiologic responses to physical activity. Increasing awareness among healthcare providers about the cardiometabolic benefits of cardiac rehabilitation may help improve referral patterns and then program utilization. And finally, policies that expand access to cardiac rehabilitation services may help address gaps in care for individuals managing both cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So I'd like to acknowledge the individuals and groups who supported the completion of this work. I'm grateful to the faculty from California University of Pennsylvania, now Penn West, whose instruction and guidance shaped the foundation of this project. I'd specifically like to call out Dr. Mark Federico, for without his support, I wouldn't have finished. Dr. Harris from Westchester University helped review my analysis plan after graduating from Cal U and ensured the data was correct. The cardiac rehabilitation staff who I worked with while collecting the data. And then finally, I want to acknowledge my family and personal support for their patience, encouragement, and understanding through the journey. This includes my parents, Mary Ellen and Fritz, and although my father's no longer with us, I know he was here in spirit. And then finally, my kids, Peyton, Kendall, and last but not least, my type 1 warrior, Owen. Last one. Thank you for your time and attention, and then I welcome any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Foster.
And
That
that
was
is it.
wonderful. That
Thank you.
you did an excellent job. And you kind of addressed this a little bit, but I just want to make sure that the group knows that this was 100% on you. You decided to do it. You went through the process. You dealt with the people at the Pennsylvania hospital system, and I think it really shows your tenacity in terms of taking on something like this, especially when it wasn't required. So I've got to give you big props for what you did and what you accomplished in terms of this presentation to this group, in terms of completing the research and submitting it for publication. So definitely, when it's published, let us know,
I
and
will.
I will certainly let the faculty of the Doctor of Health Science program at Penn West know what your accomplishments are. I do have a few questions, but I don't want to start off with the questions. I want to ask the group. Tom Kane, he is in the Doctor of Health Science program. He is almost completed his second year. Patrick Martin is in his first year. And it looks like we lost Chris, who is also in his second year. We also have the chair of the Department of Exercise, Health, and Sports Sciences, Justin Baroner. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask Dr. Foster. If not, I do have a few very difficult questions for Dr. Foster, actually, no. But I do have a few questions.
Sure.
So if Tom, Patrick, or Justin have a question, would you please unmute and ask Dr. Foster anything concerning his research?
I've got a couple,
Okay, great, Tom.
for what they're worth, or maybe just some clarifications. Your study population, I saw the average age is 68 plus.
Mhm.
I assume most of these are type 2 diabetics, or do you know?
Um, so I looked at, there were four major group buckets of individuals with diabetes. We had type 2, type 1, a non-specific type, and then the third was, oh, sorry, now it's escaping me. The largest population was type 2. I think, initially my goal was just to get the largest number of patients in to collect data. Um, you know, and this is all a learning process, but as I went through it, I learned that, really to be able to make to have valuable information, it may have been better just to focus on the type 2s.
Yeah,
And that might be something I go back and reanalyze at a later point.
yeah, just my own view assumption was that people with type 1 diabetes would have lived with this all their lives and may be situationally very different than the people who are recently or newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or haven't lived with diabetes as long as the type 1 diabetics have. And would that make a difference in the analysis? No, thanks.
It's
That makes sense.
no, and actually, it's a really good question. And I think it all depends probably on whose focus wants to talk about it. Individuals with type 1, they would say, well, they've had the disease longer. They may be suffering, more effects than
Yep.
most because type 1 does carry some inherent risks for cardiovascular disease. Where on the other hand, we would look at those with type 2 and say, individuals with type 2 usually go a long time before they're diagnosed. They can go 5, 10 longer years. They don't show that, they're not diagnosed until they're actually showing complications, and then they're having the type of complications we're talking about. So I think depending on your specialization, you could make an equal argument for saying, which one is in a worse situation.
Yeah. Um,
But thank you.
with respect to the process, you used an existing data set, and if I recall correctly, your study de-identified the data, so
Correct.
you got it with identifiers. Did that make a difference to the IRB that you had identifiers in the data set before you I de-identified them, and just in terms of
Yeah.
it's exempt or non-exempt, I guess is my
No, it's a good question. And to be honest, I think being an employee at Penn Medicine could have altered that. If I was an outside researcher, um, perhaps there would have been more concerns. I don't know. But as someone who was working with these patients, um, and had access to electronic health records, um, they were okay with me collecting the data and then once doing that, de-identifying it.
I've only conducted one study in my relatively long life, and I used an already de-identified data set.
Right.
Um, and I still got pushback from the IRB before they finally d- decided it was exempt.
Okay.
So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned it, it made me really think about it. How did I quote, is that something that was easier for me? And I don't know the answer, but I would think that if it was, being an employee at Penn Medicine had something to do with it.
Yeah. And my last, and it's really not a question, but just as I was listening to your really great presentation, your study involved individuals in a formal rehab program.
Correct.
And there are a lot of people out there who are similarly situated to your study participants who are not in a formal rehab program. And I'm just wondering how we could take the results of your study and try to, and I know your study is not generalizable in the formal sense. How do we reach that larger population that needs as much or maybe even more help than your study participants?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have an answer to that, and I don't think we need to debate that here, but that as I was listening to your presentation, I thought about that larger population and the need that exists there.
Yeah. Um, I don't have an answer for it.
Yep.
And to get involved may take a lot longer than Dr. Federico has because I do. It's one of the attractive qualities for me was cardiac rehab was that insurance covers it.
Yep.
They recognize that exercise has a benefit, so they specifically pay for, these individuals to go through this program. Why is it that just these individuals with a cardiac disease or a pulmonary disease, you know, get this benefit when individuals with diabetes don't, or another type of chronic condition? So it is. It's a unique feature of cardiac rehab that I wish was more applicable in a lot of other sections.
Yeah, I've actually picked up a couple of certifications recently in exercise oncology,
Okay.
and
Yep. That's a big area now.
it's a big area, but and
Yeah,
it's huge, but um, there's a lot of problems with how people pay for it.
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. That's it. Thanks. I appreciate it. Great
Sure.
job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And isn't that the whole implication? That's the wrong word. Isn't that the whole impetus behind of everything that you were looking at is you're dealing because you were a diabetes educator, correct?
Correct.
And you also had the unique in aspect that you were an exercise physiologist and you were working in cardiac rehab, and that's where this connection kind of came from, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, I would say that prior to my being a part of that program, um, the diabetes center worked with cardiac rehab, but not. It wasn't a close connection. If
mhm.
I mean, I don't want to criticize, but they don't have the close connection that I would have wanted them to have. And while me being a certified diabetes educator was good for the program, they didn't hire another one once I left.
Yeah.
That I think there should be a stronger connection between these two.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, and I'm just spitballing here in terms of why is cardiac rehab paid for and other types of rehab for oncology or diabetes isn't. I mean, cardiovascular and pulmonary disease is the number one killer, and it's been that for how
Yeah.
long? So I think there is a preventative aspect of it that is probably ahead of the curve.
Mhm.
We all know, and again, we're all in this program under that. We want to use wellness types, non-pharmacological types of interventions to help wellness in whatever shape or form. Is it cardiovascular disease? Is it pulmonary disease? Is it whatever? So I think we are biased in that direction a little bit because when you get into the whole hospital system and the policy and the politics of that, which is way too big for this conversation. There's a lot more going on, but it is good to see that you have that connection that's there and you've been able to determine at least some of the variables that were looked at do show an improvement. But I did have a question, and I should know this, but I don't because it's a really long time since I've done anything with cardiac rehab. What is the typical, and I know cardiac rehab is actually a lifetime type of a situation, and there's the four, is it 4 or 5 different phases? 4 phases.
There are, depends on who you ask, three
Yeah,
or four.
yeah. So what was this group? Was it 1, 2, and 3? Because four is
This would be considered a phase two program.
phase 2 program. And how
So
long
in
is
in
that
the
typically?
more the structure that the hospital followed and that I would follow too is phase one would be right after uh, the cardiac intervention, where they're just getting out of the chair, they're just trying
Right.
to get around the hallway, they're trying to get moving. Phase two would be after they are sent home from the hospital and they are starting an exercise program, but it is a monitored and supervised exercise program. And then as they're ending phase two, they begin phase three, which is exercising at home unsupervised.
Got it. And so how long were the group that you were using? How long was their phase 2 in
It varies
duration?
greatly. And I think
Okay.
that's one of the challenges. I didn't
Okay.
really get to talk a lot about that. And I think that is a challenge. Um, Typically when we bring someone in, we have to associate them a risk value for their risk of having a second cardiac event. There's high risk, medium risk, and low risk. Someone with high risk is anywhere between 36 to 24 visits. Someone at medium risk is somewhere between 24 to 18 visits. And then low risk is less than 18 visits. So within that, now someone with diabetes is typically put in the high risk category just because,
Okay.
they're dealing with more things. The individuals can choose whether they go once a week, twice a week, or 3 times a week. So there's a huge variance
That
in
is
someone
really,
who goes 36 visits but only chooses to go twice a week, as opposed to someone in a low risk category who ends up going 3 times a week. You
mhm,
know what I mean? There's
got
a great number, and I do think, as we all know, the longer you participate in something, the more time you have something to make a habit, the stronger a habit it becomes. So I think,
gotcha.
individual, and that's something I don't know if we were always supposed to do it, but I did. I always encourage people, only come twice a week. And as we get near the end and we encourage people to exercise at home, I
Yeah,
would actually say, you know what? Why don't you just start coming once a week? You're exercising at home once. Why don't we move that to twice? And you start you only come once a week. And that kind of extends their time with us. And and again, no data yet, if ever, but I think, they may have had a better chance of keeping them as habits as someone who went through very quickly.
right. And that's what I kind of did as a physical therapist too. You try to stretch those last
Yep.
few out if you could possibly do it. I was a little bit remiss. I do apologize to Patrick. Patrick, did you have any questions before I take over?
Not a problem. I just had a real quick question. And first of all, excellent presentation. I apologize. I joined
Thank you.
just a little bit late. But real quick before I get into the question, you said that what hospital system are you part of?
Penn Medicine.
Where is that out of?
So they're based, Penn Medicine is actually part of University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
So they're mainly based in the Philadelphia area, but they have spread out kind of to the tri-state area. Although, yeah, I think they're partially in Delaware. I know they're in New Jersey, and they've moved kind of west into Pennsylvania. So I guess they're more of I don't know if I qualify them as a regional health center, but I think they're slowly becoming that.
I figured they were part of Pennsylvania. We're on the west
Yep.
side, obviously, of
Yep.
the state. So, we're and I work for a hospital system out here
Okay.
too as well, several. And my question actually brings it in from my experience from cardiac rehab, being an exercise physiologist formerly. But a lot of your research and your presentation very similar to what we had done. And I wanted to ask if you had any of your research into this dissertation brought up anything regarding Dr. Dean Ornish?
I'm sorry.
If you're, has any of this research coming into this dissertation and the presentation, have you had any influence or anything, or actually any experience with Dr. Dean Ornish's research regarding cardiac rehab?
You'd have to
Um,
remind me.
oh no, that's okay.
Sorry,
No,
I'm a bit removed from the literature review I did.
no, we actually so I don't know how big it was in the eastern side, but in the western part of Pennsylvania, we had actually developed several institutes that were Dr. Dean Ornish's reversal for heart disease program.
Okay.
And that's one of the what I used to serve as a EP for. And we actually had done tons of research. As a matter of fact, one of the prerequisites was type 2 diabetes.
Right.
And we instituted the whole cardiovascular or cardiac rehab, pulmonary rehab program. And we would monitor not only just nutrition, stress management, we would include yoga instruction, dietary instruction, exercise, but then also diabetes management. And that I wasn't sure if a lot of your research into this presentation had come up with anything with Dr. Dean Ornish, but it was excellent with a lot of his literature regarding what Dr. Federico was talking about bringing this more into mainstream preventative program.
Yeah.
And that's what we had tried to do. However, that was back, what, 15 years ago. And it just seems like that prevention and being in the hospital system, I know it's all about that insurance coverage.
Yep.
It's really taking that big slide towards prevention. So that might be just, I mean, a lot of it has to do with the politics, a lot of it has to do with just the insurance coverage too, as well. But if you, I'm not sure if you want to think about seeing a little bit more about, this information, definitely check out Dr. Dean Ornish because it is
Okay.
everything that you were kind of focusing on in your scope in this presentation was exactly what the program that he had developed, and it was excellent and possibly something that you can kind of take away from and continue with, what you're doing with your career as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, I mean, the name's still blowing by me, but I think, what you talked about, it's very, and that's the good thing about cardiac rehab is they do have, there is some uniformity in how they're organized, and
Mhm.
perhaps it's his studies that helped kind of create that uniformity. They have a specific organization and you know this, they have a specific organization that credentials them. They have to do certain things in order to be credentialed. And, they hit off a lot of the same things that you've already mentioned, whether it's nutrition or stress management, exercise. They all have to have these things in order to be a certified program.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I did tremendously enjoyed your
Thank
presentation, your
you.
research, and it just kind of brought me back to that past of being in that career. So
Yeah.
good luck to you with everything. That was excellent.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Patrick. You kind of really did bring up Dean Ornish. He's somebody that, because I went through exercise science program at University of Pittsburgh many, 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 many moons ago. Um, and there was a little bit, I mean, he's been out there for a while, and his career has kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit. I think there was some kind of controversy. I don't know if you remember, Patrick. I think he was like really high up on the pedestal, and I don't know what happened. And then he kind of like plummeted, and then he started back up again. And he's had some. He was one of the few researchers that actually showed lifestyle, and that meant across the board, not just weight loss, not just nutrition, not just exercise, but um, mental health and everything to actually show reversal of heart disease after an incident. So he was one of the first ones to do it. But then again, it kind of blew up. He wrote books, and he had, other stuff that you had to buy and a plan, etc. So I don't know. I don't know a ton about him, Patrick, but you did spark my memory there in terms of him. I just had two simple questions, and then one final question.
Sure.
Oh, the obesity classification. How was the obesity classification not necessarily done by you, but by the hospital system? And also, I noticed there was the BMI as well, and we all know that there are some limitations with that BMI. So,
Absolutely.
what was the classification used by the hospital system to say that this individual was or was not obese?
They used the regular BMI
Okay.
classification. So the idea was that if you were over 25, you were considered to be obese, um, or no, overweight. And then if you were over 30, um, which you're right, it's certainly has its flaws. Um,
It's something that you could classify them. I mean, you can't, I mean, that's not a be all end all type of a
right.
variable, but it does, it's quick and easy. It's
Yeah.
quick, easy, and dirty
Yep.
to be
And
able
that's
to
yeah, quick and
classify. And
dirty.
that's what we're doing. Okay. I thought that was the case, but I wasn't sure. The other thing that really kind of was the biggest, like, wow, not saying the whole thing wasn't, but the diastolic blood pressures. I don't know if you remember what they were, but they were lower than I expected them to be, especially with that group, especially with hypertension as one of the diagnostic um, uh, elements that were looked in there. That the diastolic was in the 60s.
Yeah.
Were you surprised to see that? And again, I know we're always going through this change of what is considered normal blood pressure, and now it's like anything over 120 over 80 is actually considered lower end hypertension, where before it's like, yeah, that was great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was very surprised to see those diastolic numbers. Um, give me your impression of that.
So, and I wanted to circle back to the weight thing first, but I do want to answer the blood pressure one as well. Um, and uh, and I'm sorry, was it Patrick?
Patrick,
Was the
yes.
individual with the cardiac rehab experience? He
Yes.
he could probably attest to this. In our program, we were more focused on nutrition that was heart healthy, as opposed to nutrition for weight loss. So I think that could be part of the focus. We weren't necessarily talking about cutting calories. We were talking about, which foods were better for you in a heart healthy way. And I think
Gotcha.
that could
Okay.
be part of the reason why those numbers are the way they are, along with the idea that BMI probably isn't the best indicator. Um, that was something I had actually asked about before I left was that, could there be any interest in cardiac rehab, maybe changing the focus a little bit? But that does require then more medical intervention and what are they actually going to do? So, that became it was something they were talking about, but they were still talking about when I left.
Mhm.
Um, the second thing for blood pressure, you're right. It's a lot lower. Um, I was surprised. We had people with blood pressures that were lower than 60. That were walking around fine. And
Huh.
the way one of the cardiologists had explained to me was that it was very patient dependent and was, if they were fine at 60, then they were probably fine. An individual who's not doing well at 60, you would know it and they would raise it. A
Yeah.
lot of that had to do with the medication management. And that's
Ah,
one thing that is, and as you said it,
okay.
I just realized, wow, I didn't include that at all in my discussion.
Okay.
But medication management, I'm sure has a lot to do with it.
Gotcha. Okay.
They can easily put someone on um, a beta block, not a beta blocker, but they could put them on something that would reduce their blood pressure by quite a bit.
Yeah, that was the
Yep.
connection that I
Yeah.
needed that I was not picking up on, that
Yeah.
these people are obviously on
Right. Right.
hypertensive medications. And,
Exactly.
again, you've got to look at which class, et cetera. So
Yeah. And
thank you for that.
in my journal entry and in the dissertation and then the journal entry, I said, this was something I could not go back and evaluate. There was no
Okay.
way for me to do that since everybody is so individualized,
Hmm.
it's so personalized. Yet, so that should certainly help have an impact on the results. Yet, oftentimes, um, medication is reduced because of what we do in cardiac rehab.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So someone might come in at a higher number for medication and have that. I never want to. Of course, we saw examples where it was eliminated,
Hmm.
but in most of the cases it was reduced.
Reduced.
And that's
Okay.
so it's they work in context with each other.
Yeah, I'm actually feeling a little dumb that I didn't pick up on that, but it's okay. You did a great job of answering the question. And that actually wasn't the question that I wanted to finish with. My question is what would you say is the biggest single takeaway that you got from completing this study and going through the process?
Wow.
That was supposed to be a
Well,
softball.
I mean, and again, it's cardiac rehab always has the focus on the cardiac outcomes. That's always been the focus. Glycemic measures have never really been talked about, or maybe not, shouldn't say they've never been talked about, but it hasn't been highlighted to the degree that cardiac outcomes have. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. There are so many, cardiovascular disease is so prevalent in the diabetes community, that we really need to put a focus on that. So I think cardiac rehab, we already know that cardiac rehab is underutilized,
Hmm.
you know, but I think even more so in the diabetes community, if there's some way that we can expand the parameters of who is available to go to cardiac rehab, then I think we'd go a long way in helping these populations.
Okay, great. I really do think that this is a wonderful research territory that you can continue to investigate as you move through your career. It's certainly I don't want to say it's novel, but it's certainly a niche type of a look because people aren't looking at it. I
Yeah.
mean that's
Yeah.
obvious. Oh, and by the way, I did a quick look of your references. Dean Ornish is not in your references. So that's
Thanks for
all.
calling that out. Thanks for calling that out on the video. That
Oh,
was
no,
that's
no,
good.
no, no. It's just I didn't mean it that way. It's
No, it's
just
okay.
like I mean,
And it's funny when you said that when you started saying like, he was there were products you had to buy. I may have looked at them and thought like, oh,
Yeah.
he's hawking something. I don't want to talk about that.
And his
It's very
career did
possible.
go
It's hard
through
to
that.
know because, the literature review was so long ago, but
Yeah, yeah. I didn't mean that as a negative.
I
It was
know
like,
it's okay.
because again, I mean, there was a period of time where his name was not as, you know, the he was not on the apex
Right.
at a period of time. And again, Patrick, you may know this. I don't, because I don't really follow this type of the I don't really follow and read a lot of the cardiovascular cardiac rehab literature anymore. I mean, I did, but that was in the caveman realm. So, but no, awesome job. Thank you for reaching out to me to be able to do this in terms of presenting. I thank everybody that attended, especially Tom and Patrick for asking great questions. And thank you, Mary Ellen, for being there in case the pump shows up. Did you have anything you wanted to say in terms of any parting shots or any closing? And then I'll go ahead and turn the recording off and we'll just kind of chat for a little bit at the end after everybody leaves.
Yeah, I mean, I think I learned so much about the research process going through this dissertation, and that's why we do it.
Hmm.
Um, it's if I had the chance to redo it over, I might go about it in an entirely different way. Who knows?
Okay.
But I think that's part
Right.
of the process is going through and
Absolutely.
learning what worked, what didn't, and then how you would do it differently. I do know, this is something that I am going to approach Penn Medicine about.
Hmm.
Chester County, where I did the research, it is wealthy, white. It is certain one population, but the
Right.
Philadelphia area itself is not like that. And Penn Medicine certainly has access to other hospitals.
Right.
So I think this would be interesting, in trying to expand it, what the results might look like in other parts of the city. So it's something that, and I had not thought about doing that, when I was first doing the dissertation. It's probably like most people, I just want to get it done and get it over with.
Right. Yep.
But, now looking back at it as I'm starting to submit it, I'm realizing, this could be a new avenue of research, and I'd love to help with that. So,
The best research doesn't answer your question, it creates more questions. So that sounds like that happened to you. So thank you again. I do appreciate all of the time that you took, not only doing the research and writing your manuscript, but creating the presentation, practicing the presentation, reaching out to me to do this. So I must commend you on a
thank you.
wonderful and well done job. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. There we go.